Some nights, the house was louder when no one was speaking. I remember sitting on the edge of the porch, listening to the rain tap against the wood, wondering how a place that once held so much life could feel so quiet. Back then, we didn't call it loneliness. We just called it evening. People today talk about the past like it was simple, like life moved slower because it had less weight. But that isn't true. It was heavy in ways that never made the history books. Heavy with responsibility. Heavy with silence. Heavy with moments you didn't realize were memories until they were already gone. In our neighborhood, everyone knew when someone was missing before anyone ever said a word. A chair stayed empty. Porch light didn't turn on. A voice that used to float through the screen door never came back. And still, life went on. It always did. I was young, but I remember watching the adults closely. Not because they explained things to us, but because they didn't. Their faces told the real story. The way they paused before sitting down. The way they stayed a little longer on the porch after sunset. The way they listened not just to the rain, but to their own thoughts. There were no speeches about hardship. No dramatic goodbyes. Just small routines that carried us forward. A warm meal shared without conversation. A cup placed gently on the table. A look that said everything without saying anything at all. And years later, when I think back to those nights, I don't remember the rain as much as I remember the stillness. The kind of stillness that teaches you something about life, about patience, about endurance, about how people survive not by speaking louder, but by holding on quietly. This is one of those stories, not the kind you rush through, but the kind that waits for you, the way the past always does. There are some evenings that never really end. They just sit inside you, quietly, waiting to be remembered. I didn't understand that back then. I only knew the rain had stopped and the porch was wet beneath my feet. The air smelled like damp wood and something warm drifting from the kitchen. That smell always meant one thing in our house. Supper was almost ready. Inside, pots spoke their own language. A slow simmer, a wooden spoon tapping the side of a pot. No rush, no measuring cups, just memory. My mother moved the way she always did, steady and sure, like the food already knew her hands. She didn't look at a clock. She never had to. Time lived in the stove, in the sound of bubbling gravy, in the way she knew exactly when to turn the heat down. I remember sitting at the table, listening, not talking, just listening. The house felt full even before the plates came out. Food wasn't just food then. It was proof that the day had been survived, that whatever the world had taken, it hadn't taken everything. Outside, the sky was darkening, but inside, light stayed a little longer. Steam fogged the windows. Rainwater slid slowly off the porch steps. When my father finally came in, he didn't say much. He washed his hands. He sat down. That was enough. The first bite always came with silence. Not because we were told to be quiet, but because some moments ask for respect. Years later, I would understand what that table really was. It wasn't just wood and chairs. It was shelter. It was memory being made before anyone knew it mattered. And even now, when the world feels too fast, I find myself missing that sound. Pot simmering low. A house breathing slowly. A meal that meant more than being full. By the time I understood what those evenings really meant, most of them were already gone. The voices that once filled the porch had softened, then faded. Chairs that used to scrape against wooden floors stayed perfectly still. The house didn't change much, but the silence did. It grew heavier with every passing year. I remember one evening in particular. The sky was low and gray, the kind that promised rain but never delivered it. I sat alone where others once gathered, listening to the wind brush against the walls. In that moment, it became clear that the stories weren't carried by the food or the place alone. They lived in the pauses between words, in the way people lingered before standing up, in the way laughter echoed just a second longer than it needed to. Back then, no one thought to write anything down. There was no urgency. Life felt steady. Traditions felt permanent. Meals were repeated so often they seemed impossible to forget. But memory, I learned, doesn't fade all at once. It slips away quietly. First, the small details go. Then the order of events. Eventually, even the feeling becomes harder to reach. I've tried to recreate those moments since then. Sitting at the same table, waiting for the same comfort to return. But time doesn't respond to imitation. It only responds to attention. And attention is something we rarely give until it's too late. Now, when I think back, I realize those ordinary days were never ordinary at all. They were teaching us how to belong, how to stay, how to listen. We just didn't know it yet. And by the time we did, the lesson had already ended. By the time the sun began to sink behind the houses, the street felt quieter than it should have. Not empty, just hushed like it was listening. Thomas stayed seated on the porch step, his hands resting where his father's once had. He remembered how evenings used to stretch forever. Back then, the air carried voices. Laughter floated from open windows. Someone always called out a name. came, someone always answered. Now the houses stood closed, the curtains drawn, the porches clean but unused. The street hadn't vanished, it had simply learned how to be alone. He thought about how quickly life moves when you're inside it, and how slowly it returns when you're old enough to look back. Years that once felt ordinary now shimmered with meaning. Meals shared without planning. Conversations that didn't need purpose. People who showed up simply because that's what people did. Thomas realized something then. The memories weren't heavy. They weren't painful. They were gentle, like a hand on the shoulder reminding him that he had belonged to something real. The past didn't ask to be relived. It only asked to be remembered. As the sky darkened, a porch light flickered on across the street. Just one. But it was enough. A small glow in a long evening. Proof that not everything was gone. Thomas stood slowly, feeling the weight of his years, but also the quiet comfort they carried. He took one last look down Maple Street, not with sadness, but with gratitude. Some places don't disappear. They simply wait for someone to remember them. And tonight, that was enough. By the time evening settled in, the street felt quieter than Thomas remembered. Not just quiet in sound, but quiet in spirit. Houses still stood where they always had, yet something invisible was missing. The small rituals, the shared moments, the feeling that someone was always watching out for you. Thomas remembered how neighbors once borrowed sugar without asking, how doors stayed unlocked, how evenings were measured not by clocks, but by the smell of dinner drifting through open windows. Back then, food wasn't just food. It was an invitation, a reason to gather, a way of saying, you belong here. He paused near the corner where Mrs. Ellis used to sit every afternoon, shelling peas into a metal bowl while greeting everyone who passed. She's been gone for decades now, so has the sound of that bowl tapping softly against her porch chair. No one ever replaced her spot. No one ever could. Time has a way of moving forward without asking permission. Takes things quietly, one by one, until you realize you've been standing in a different world for years. Thomas felt that truth deeply now. The street had survived, the buildings remained, but the heart of the place lived only in memory. Still, as he stood there, a warmth rose in his chest, because those memories had shaped him. They taught him patience. They taught him gratitude. They taught him that even simple things, shared meals, kind words, familiar faces, could carry a lifetime of meaning. And maybe that was the lesson. Not everything needs to be replaced. Some things are meant to live on only through the people who remember them, through stories told quietly, through moments like this, standing alone, feeling full without holding anything at all. Thomas took a slow breath and turned toward home, carrying the past with him, light enough to walk forward, heavy enough to never forget. By the time the streetlights flickered on, the neighborhood had gone quiet again, the kind of quiet that only comes when life has slowly moved elsewhere. Thomas remained on the porch, not because he had nowhere to go, but because leaving felt like closing a door he wasn't ready to shut. He looked down at his hands, thinner now, spotted with age, and tried to remember when they last felt strong. These hands once carried groceries up these steps, once fixed loose boards on this porch, once lifted children into the air as laughter echoed down the street. Back then, time felt endless. Days stretched wide, and the future seemed generous. What Thomas missed most wasn't the noise. It was the certainty that someone would knock, that someone would sit beside him without needing an invitation, that the house behind him wasn't just wood and nails, but a place where memories were still being made. He thought of names he hadn't spoken out loud in years, faces that lived now only in his mind. Some had moved away, some had passed on, and some, like him, were simply still here, learning how to live with absence. The porch creaked softly beneath him, the same sound it had always made. That small, familiar noise brought a faint smile to his face. Not everything was gone. Some things had stayed. Quiet things, patient things. Thomas breathed in the cool evening air and let it settle in his chest. He wasn't waiting for the past to return. He knew it wouldn't, but sitting here in this moment, he could still feel connected to who he had been, to the life that shaped him, and for now that was enough.